In the vast and dazzling halls of the Arthian palace, the air was thick with the scent of exotic flowers, and the sound of melodious music filled the grand banquet hall. The vast walls, lined with shimmering tapestries and golden relics, told stories of the empire's many victories and centuries of royal heritage. Princess Thalassa, the jewel of the Arthian Empire, sat gracefully upon her ornate throne, watching the scene unfold before her. Men, noble and powerful from every corner of the galaxy, surrounded her. They were eager to prove their worth, to offer gifts, and most importantly, to win her heart. But Thalassa felt none of the excitement or anticipation that these suitors so clearly displayed. She had grown weary of their attention, their flattery, their over-the-top gifts. They were all the same, handsome, yes, well-educated, wealthy, and strong, but none of them had what she truly wanted, sincerity. None of them spoke to her heart or looked at her with genuine admiration. They only saw her as the future queen, an asset to be claimed for political power and a stepping stone to greater influence. As the evening wore on, one suitor after another tried his luck, each more eager than the last to win her favor. One tried to impress her with his skill in the art of swordsmanship. Another offered her rare and ancient jewels from the farthest reaches of the universe. And still others spoke of their vast fortunes, hoping to catch her interest with promises of a luxurious life. Yet none of them moved her. Princess Thalassa's eyes wandered around the room, scanning the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. She watched as each man tried harder than the last, but they never once took the time to truly understand her. Thalassa had been brought up to be a ruler, a leader of the Arthian Empire, and she knew her duty. She had been trained in politics, diplomacy, and war since she was a child. She understood that one day she would have to marry and unite the empire through her marriage. Her parents, especially her father, had always reminded her of the importance of this union, of the need to maintain the empire's strength and influence. The royal bloodline had to remain pure, and her choice of a partner had to be one of power and respect. But what if she didn't want any of this? What if she didn't want to be married off like a prized possession? The princess took a deep breath, shifting her gaze from the suitors to the grand window that overlooked the sprawling city below. She saw the people of Arthian, common folk, soldiers, workers, moving about their daily lives, unaware of the game being played in the palace. They went about their business, living simple lives, working hard for what little they had. For a brief moment, Thalassa wished she could trade places with them. She longed for the freedom to choose her own destiny, without the weight of a crown on her head or the pressure to marry for power. Her musings were interrupted as another suitor approached, this time a young prince from a neighboring system. He was tall and handsome, with sharp features and the confident air of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He bowed before her with a practiced smile, and Thalassa could already predict what he would say before he even spoke. "Your Highness," he began, his voice smooth and charming, "it is an honor to be in your presence. I have traveled far to offer you a gift, a symbol of my admiration for you." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a sparkling, jewel-encrusted necklace, its diamonds glistening in the dim light of the hall. The princess forced a smile, accepting the gift but feeling nothing more than a fleeting sense of politeness. She knew what came next. "I would be honored if you would wear this," the prince continued, his eyes glinting with an almost predatory gleam. "It would be a great honor to stand by your side as your consort, to help lead the Arthian Empire to even greater heights." Thalassa's heart sank. There it was again. The same words, the same promises, the same hollow offers. They didn't care about her as a person. They cared only about what she represented. A royal marriage was more than a union of hearts. It was a political alliance, a way to secure power and influence. "I am deeply honored by your gift," Thalassa replied, her voice measured, her smile polite but distant. "But as you know, my heart does not belong to me alone. I have been raised to serve the people of Arthian and to fulfill my royal duties. I cannot marry for mere admiration or luxury." The prince's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He quickly masked it with a look of understanding, nodding his head. "Of course, Your Highness, I understand the weight of your position, but I hope you will remember that true power can only be achieved through unity. Together, we can make Arthian the greatest empire in the galaxy." But Thalassa was already looking past him, her attention elsewhere. Another suitor had arrived, and the cycle repeated itself. The princess had heard these words 1,000 times before. "Together we can rule. Together we can conquer." It was always about power. It was never about her, never about her own desires or wishes. As the night wore on, Thalassa grew increasingly restless. She had been sitting on the throne for hours, politely nodding and accepting gifts, but her mind was elsewhere. She needed to escape, if only for a moment. The pressure of the evening was suffocating, and she needed a breath of fresh air, away from the walls of the palace that felt more like a prison with each passing moment. Excusing herself from the crowd, she made her way to a small balcony overlooking the gardens. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, the sound of distant birds singing in the trees below providing a soothing contrast to the noise of the palace. She leaned against the railing, closing her eyes for a moment and allowing herself a rare moment of peace. Her thoughts wandered once more to the future. She had been told since she was a child that her marriage would be the key to the empire's prosperity. She had been groomed for this role. Her duty was clear. But the more she saw of the suitors, the more she realized that none of them truly saw her as a person. They saw her as an object to be claimed, a crown to be worn. But what if there was more to her than just a royal title? What if there was someone out there who could see beyond her status, someone who could love her for who she truly was? The thought lingered in her mind, but she quickly pushed it aside. There was no time for such dreams. There was no room for love in a life bound by duty. But just as she was about to return inside, something caught her eye. In the distance, just beyond the palace gates, she saw a figure. At first, she thought it was one of the guards, but as she looked closer, she realized that it was someone unfamiliar. A human. A soldier dressed in simple, unadorned armor. His face was rugged, weathered by the harshness of his travels, and his eyes were sharp, filled with an intensity that made her pause. He stood in the shadow of the gate as if waiting for something or someone. Thalassa was intrigued. She had seen many soldiers in her time, but none quite like him. There was something about the way he stood, so grounded, so unbothered by the grandeur of the palace behind him. His presence felt different from the sycophantic suitors who filled the court. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he wasn't offering empty promises, he was simply there. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, Thalassa found herself wanting to know more about him. The next morning, the grand palace was alive with activity, but Princess Thalassa's mind was far from the usual political gatherings, royal banquets, and courtly affairs. She had spent much of the night lying awake, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the soldier she had glimpsed the evening before. There was something about him that caught her attention, something she could not easily explain. He was different, unpolished, and real in a way that the men around her could never be. His presence had stood out like a stark contrast to the endless parade of polished princes and lords, all trying to win her favor with their charm and grand gestures. The more she thought about it, the more curious she became. She had spent years in the company of powerful, influential men who spoke of empires, alliances, and power, but none of them had ever sparked even a fraction of the curiosity she felt towards this simple soldier. She wanted to know more about him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that even asking about a common soldier like him was somehow beneath her station. Still, the thought of him lingered in her mind, refusing to leave. As the day wore on, Thalassa found herself drifting in and out of the conversations that surrounded her. Her father, Emperor Zorath, had gathered his advisors to discuss the state of the empire, the ongoing wars on distant planets, and the important alliances that needed to be forged. The weight of it all pressed down on her like a heavy cloak. Her father had always emphasized the importance of maintaining strong political ties, and each day she could feel the burden of expectations growing heavier. But none of it mattered to her, not anymore. For the first time in years, Thalassa felt truly lost. She could hear the voices of the lords around her, discussing matters of great importance, but it all sounded like white noise. The quiet hum of her thoughts drowned out everything else. All she could think about was the soldier standing outside the gates, waiting in the shadows. The hours passed, and eventually the meetings came to an end. Thalassa excused herself from the council chambers, her mind still heavy with thoughts of the mysterious soldier. She told herself it was foolish to even consider it, but the more she tried to push it aside, the more it consumed her thoughts. Later that afternoon, she found herself walking through the palace gardens, seeking a moment of solitude. The warm sunlight bathed the lush greenery in a soft golden glow, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. The gardens had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the rigid expectations of royal life. Here she could forget the weight of the crown, if only for a moment. As she walked among the flowers, her mind wandered back to the soldier. What could he possibly be doing in the palace courtyard? She couldn't fathom why someone like him, someone so ordinary, so unremarkable by royal standards, would draw her attention. He wasn't a prince, a noble, or a warrior of renown. He was just a soldier, a man of humble origins who seemed far removed from her world. Yet despite all of this, something about him had intrigued her. He had not tried to impress her with false charm or grand gestures. Instead, he had simply stood there, his presence alone commanding her attention. It was an honesty she had not seen in anyone else. It was raw and genuine, and it made her wonder if he saw her as something more than just a royal title. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts, pulling her out of her reverie. "Your Highness, I have been looking for you." It was her personal attendant, Lyria, a kind woman who had served the royal family for many years. Lyria had always been there for Thalassa, offering her advice and guidance when needed, though she often struggled to get the princess's attention during times of inner turmoil. Thalassa turned to face her with a soft smile. "I'm sorry, Lyria," she said, trying to mask the confusion that had clouded her thoughts. "I was lost in thought." Lyria raised an eyebrow, clearly aware that something was troubling her. "If you don't mind my saying, Your Highness, you've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" Thalassa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's nothing, Lyria, just the weight of everything that's been happening lately." Lyria seemed unconvinced, but didn't press further. "The council is waiting for you. Your father would like to discuss the upcoming formal dinner tonight." Thalassa nodded, though her mind was still elsewhere. "I'll be there shortly." As Lyria walked away, Thalassa felt a strange pang of guilt. Her duties were clear, but her heart felt torn in so many directions. The more she tried to push the soldier from her mind, the more the idea of him seemed to linger. She couldn't let it go. She had never felt this way about anyone, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. She had always been the strong, independent princess, unwavering in her focus on duty and the needs of the empire. But now, something inside her was shifting, and she didn't know if she was ready to face it. Later that evening, Thalassa sat in the grand hall, the table set with elegant dishes and gleaming silverware. The palace was alive with activity as nobles and dignitaries gathered for the formal dinner, each one vying for her attention in hopes of securing favor. Her father sat at the head of the table, as always, his gaze fixed on the guests. The room was filled with laughter, polite conversation, and the clinking of glasses, yet to Thalassa it all felt hollow. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the men who had made their advances in the past. They were all gathered here, surrounding her, each one trying to make their case, but none of them caught her interest. Not one of them had ever given her the sense that they were truly interested in her as a person. They wanted power, they wanted the throne, but they didn't want her. Her thoughts drifted once more to the soldier. She couldn't seem to rid herself of the image of him standing at the gates, his rugged face framed by the shadows. He wasn't like the other men. He didn't need to impress her with gifts or empty promises. He had simply stood there, calm and steady, without the airs of a noble or a prince. Thalassa's heart skipped a beat when she realized that she had been thinking about him for hours. She tried to focus on the conversation around her, but her mind kept drifting back to the soldier. What was it about him? Why did he stand out so much in her mind when all the other men seemed so forgettable? As the evening wore on, the dinner continued, but Thalassa felt more and more disconnected from everything around her. The laughter, the polite conversation, the grandeur of the palace, all of it felt so distant, so far removed from what she truly desired. She longed for something more, something real. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the evening came to an end. The guests began to file out of the hall, and Thalassa made her way to the balcony once more, seeking solace in the quiet night. The stars twinkled above her, and the cool night air brushed against her skin. She leaned against the railing, staring out into the distance, her thoughts once again consumed by the soldier. She wanted to know more about him. She needed to know more about him. There was something about his honesty, his simplicity, that stirred something deep within her. He had seen through the facade of her royal life, and for the first time in ages, she wondered if there was someone out there who could see her for who she truly was, not just as a princess, but as a woman. And yet, despite all her feelings, Thalassa knew that the future she had been trained for awaited her. The empire would need a strong leader, and she would have to marry. It was her duty, her responsibility. But as she stood there, gazing at the stars, she couldn't help but wonder, could there be more to her life than duty? Could there be room for love? Her heart longed for an answer, but for now, it remained silent. The days following the royal dinner seemed to stretch on endlessly for Princess Thalassa. The usual routines of court life returned with an almost oppressive normalcy, and despite the many suitors still vying for her attention, her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked at one of them, she couldn't help but compare them to the soldier she had seen just outside the palace gates. She had only caught a glimpse of him, but something in the simplicity of his presence had left an impression on her. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before. The more she tried to focus on her duties as princess, the more she found herself distracted by the thought of him. The human soldier, standing there, looking out of place but undeniably real. He hadn't tried to impress her with words or gifts, as all the other men did. He had just been there, and that was enough to stir something inside her that she didn't understand. As the hours and days passed, Thalassa began to question what it was that kept pulling her thoughts back to him. Was it his simplicity, his humility, or was it just the fact that he was different from all the others? She didn't know, but she couldn't seem to shake the feeling. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something she had never felt before. She found herself wandering the palace corridors, looking for something, anything, that would distract her from these thoughts. Her duties were still demanding, and her father, Emperor Zorath, had continued to remind her that the future of the empire rested on her shoulders. The pressures of royal life were heavy, and she knew that her marriage would be a key part of securing the empire's future. But no matter how much she focused on that reality, her mind kept drifting back to the soldier, to the possibility of something different. One afternoon, as she was walking through the palace gardens, her personal attendant Lyria caught up with her. The woman had become more perceptive over the years, and Thalassa could tell that Lyria was beginning to notice the princess's restlessness. "Your Highness, is everything well?" Lyria asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. "You seem distracted." Thalassa gave a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just thinking, Lyria, it's nothing." Lyria didn't seem convinced but didn't press further. "If you say so, but the council is waiting for you. They have important matters to discuss." Thalassa sighed. "Of course, I'll be there shortly." As Lyria walked away, Thalassa's thoughts wandered back to the soldier. There was no logical reason for her obsession with him. He was just a man, a soldier, someone from a faraway colony who had no place in her life. He wasn't royalty, he wasn't a powerful ally, and he certainly wasn't someone who could help her maintain the strength of the empire. Yet, for some reason, she couldn't stop thinking about him. His presence, however fleeting, had ignited something inside her that she had long suppressed, something that yearned for a connection that wasn't defined by titles or power. Thalassa returned to the council chambers, but her attention was no longer fully on the political discussions that surrounded her. Her mind kept drifting, and despite her best efforts to focus, she could feel the weight of her father's expectations pressing on her shoulders. He had always made it clear that her marriage would not just be a personal decision, it would be a political one. She was expected to marry someone who could help solidify the empire's alliances and strengthen its position in the galaxy. But none of the suitors that surrounded her seemed to understand that. None of them seemed to care about her thoughts, her desires, or her future. They cared only about what she could offer them. It was the same routine, day after day. The suitors would come, offer their gifts, and speak of alliances and power, but none of them ever spoke to her heart. None of them ever made her feel like she was more than just a pawn in a political game. It was all so exhausting. And then there was the soldier. The thought of him was like a breath of fresh air in a room full of stale promises. One evening, after yet another tiresome round of courtly affairs, Thalassa found herself once again standing on the balcony that overlooked the palace gardens. The sun had just set, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape. The cool evening breeze ruffled her hair, and for a moment she allowed herself to relax, breathing in the calmness of the night. She leaned against the railing, staring out at the city below, lost in her thoughts. Her mind wandered back to the soldier. What was it about him? He had been so different from all the others. There had been no arrogance in his demeanor, no hidden agenda in his actions. He had simply been present, and that for some reason had left a lasting impression on her. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. There was no place for this kind of distraction in her life. She was the heir to the Arthian throne. Her marriage would be the cornerstone of the Empire's future. It didn't matter if she was intrigued by a common soldier. Her destiny had already been decided. But even as she told herself this, part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from her life. She had been raised to be a ruler, to lead the Empire, but somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of who she was as a person. She had been molded into a leader, but no one had ever bothered to ask her what she wanted. No one had ever cared about her dreams, her desires, or her heart. Thalassa was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. It wasn't until a voice broke through the quiet that she realized someone was there. "Your Highness," the voice said. She turned around, startled to see a man standing in the shadows just beyond the balcony. For a moment she didn't recognize him, but then it hit her. It was the soldier, Roderick Stone. He was standing just outside the moonlight, his posture casual but still commanding. His eyes, though tired from the day's duties, held a steady gaze, and for a moment Thalassa felt as if time had stopped. She was speechless. How had he found his way here? "I'm sorry to disturb you, Your Highness," he said, his voice calm but respectful. "I know this is not my place, but I wanted to speak with you." Thalassa's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly composed herself. "What is it, soldier?" "I didn't mean to intrude," he began, stepping forward slightly. "But I've been thinking about something you said the other day, about the weight of duty, about the choices that are made for us. I understand that your life is not your own, but I wanted to tell you that. You don't have to carry that weight alone." Thalassa was taken aback by his words. She had never spoken so openly about her struggles with anyone, let alone someone like him. But here he was, standing before her, offering words of comfort without any hint of trying to gain favor or manipulate her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity getting the better of her. Roderick hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I believe that, even in a world full of politics and power, there is still room for honesty, and I think you deserve to have a choice. A real choice, not one dictated by others." Thalassa stared at him, her heart pounding. His words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any political speech she had ever heard. There was something about him, something in his sincerity, that made her feel as though, for once, she wasn't just a princess. She was a person. For a long moment the two of them stood there, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. It was as if the weight of the world had momentarily lifted, and in its place was something she had longed for without even realizing it, a connection, however fleeting, that felt real. I don't know what to say," Thalassa whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been taught all my life that my duty comes first, but what if? What if I don't want that life? What if I want something more?" Roderick smiled gently, his eyes filled with understanding. "Then, Your Highness, perhaps it's time to start making your own choices." For the first time in a long while, Thalassa felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than duty, and for the first time she didn't feel so alone. The next few days passed in a blur for Princess Thalassa. The conversation she had shared with Roderick lingered in her mind, but she struggled to push it aside, knowing full well the weight of her duties. She had always been a princess, always expected to lead, to marry for the sake of the Empire, to maintain the delicate balance of power within the galaxy. But something about Roderick's words had unsettled her. He had spoken of choice, of a different kind of life, one where she wasn't confined by the expectations of those around her. Her mind often drifted back to that moment on the balcony, his voice calm and steady, offering her something she had longed for without realizing it, freedom. It was a strange thought, one that she had never entertained before. The idea that she could have the power to choose her own destiny was foreign, almost impossible, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she wanted it. Every time she returned to the palace for one of her royal duties, the endless procession of suitors, each one more polished than the last, became harder to bear. They all spoke of power, of alliances, of what their marriage could mean for the Empire, but none of them ever spoke to her as a person. None of them ever asked what she wanted, what she dreamed of, what she truly desired. Her father, Emperor Zorath, had always been clear about her role. He had raised her to be a leader, to follow the rules of the Empire, to think of the greater good above all else. Marriage was simply another political tool in a ruler's arsenal. It didn't matter whether or not she loved her future husband. What mattered was the strength of the alliance, the stability it would bring to the empire. But Thalassa couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more to life than this. She had been taught to put duty above all else, to sacrifice her own desires for the sake of the empire. Yet, as she stood in the midst of it all, she realized that she was slowly losing herself. She was becoming a figurehead, a symbol of power and authority, but not a person who was truly seen, not a woman who was allowed to choose her own path. She thought of Roderick again. He was nothing like the men who filled the halls of the palace, the ones who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. He wasn't after her title or her wealth. He hadn't tried to impress her with gifts or promises. He had simply spoken to her as a person, as someone who had their own dreams and desires. It was something she had never experienced before. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she wanted to know him better, to understand who he was and what drove him. She had heard of him from a few of the palace guards, how he had come to Arthian as part of a diplomatic mission, a soldier from a distant colony. There was something about him, something genuine and unpretentious, that called to her. One afternoon, as she wandered through the palace gardens, trying to clear her mind, she found herself near the gate where she had seen him standing a few days before. The memory of that moment came flooding back, and for the first time she felt the urge to go out there again to see if he was still there. She knew it was dangerous. She was the princess, the future ruler of the empire, and she couldn't afford to be seen as anything less than regal, perfect, untouchable. But a part of her, an unfamiliar part, was tired of that image. She was tired of the mask she had to wear every day, of the roles she was expected to play. She wanted to see Roderick again, to speak to him, to ask him the questions that had been swirling in her mind ever since their first conversation. With a deep breath, she made up her mind. She would go to the gate. She would speak to him, even if it meant breaking the rules of courtly decorum. For the first time in years, she was making a choice for herself, not for the empire, not for her father, but for her own heart. The gate was quiet when she arrived, the guards at their posts, oblivious to her presence. Thalassa approached the area where Roderick had stood, looking out into the distance. She didn't know what she was expecting. Perhaps he wouldn't be there, perhaps he had left the palace grounds. But as she rounded the corner, she saw him again, standing just as he had before, looking out over the city with a sense of quiet contemplation. She stopped a few feet away, her heart racing. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to say, how to approach him. She had never done anything like this before, approaching someone without the armor of her title, without the walls of the palace around her. It felt strange, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Roderick!" He turned around at the sound of her voice, a look of surprise crossing his face. But there was no fear or hesitation in his eyes, only calm recognition. He didn't bow or stand at attention as most people would in her presence. He simply smiled, a small but genuine smile that made her heart flutter. "Your Highness," he said, his voice warm and unguarded. "I didn't expect to see you here." Thalassa stepped closer, her hands clasped together in front of her. "I came to speak with you," she said. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other day." Roderick nodded, as if he understood the weight of her words. "I'm glad to hear that." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "You spoke of choice, of freedom. I don't think I've ever really had that. I've always been told what to do, what my future should be, and now, with everything that's happening, I don't know what to think anymore." Roderick listened attentively, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You're not alone in feeling that way," he said softly. "I can't imagine the burden of being a ruler, the pressure of making decisions that affect millions of lives. But even in that position, there's always room for choice. It's just a matter of finding it." Thalassa looked down, her mind swirling. "But how do I find it? How do I choose when everything I've been taught says that I have no other option but to follow the path laid out for me?" Roderick took a small step closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You have to listen to your own heart, Your Highness. You have to decide what you want for yourself, not for anyone else. It won't be easy, and there will be consequences, but sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead to true freedom." Thalassa's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was more to her life than just fulfilling her duties as a ruler. But it was so hard to imagine anything else. Her life had always been mapped out for her. Every decision, every move had been made with the Empire's interests at heart, not her own. But now, as she stood here with Roderick, she began to realize that he was right. She had the power to choose, even if it meant going against everything she had been taught. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of something she had long since buried deep inside her own desires, her own dreams. "I don't know what to do," Thalassa whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have to know all the answers right away," Roderick said. "Just take it one step at a time, listen to yourself, and trust that you'll find the right path." Thalassa looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she found was honesty. For a moment she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the suffocating expectations that had bound her all her life. There was a world beyond the palace walls, a world where she could make her own choices, find her own path. And perhaps for the first time, she realized that she didn't have to do it alone.